I'm very glad to participate in this meeting, and I would like to begin by expressing my deepest thanks and appreciation to Pilar and to her team who have managed to organize such a wonderful international series on the translation of children's literature and have proven that Corona or not, we shall overcome. We're not going to give in because of the Corona. And though I'm not very fond of Zoom meeting, I must admit that it gives an opportunity for people to meet from all over the world. I was overwhelmed by the list of participants. So we should take advantage of it, but still look forward to meeting in person. Let's hope in the near future. Now I'll turn to my talk, and my talk, as you've noticed, the title has changed a little bit. It's Cultural Translation, Accommodation, and Domestication in Translation of Children's Literature. Now, it all began one day when, during my research stay in Paris, my partner and I were sitting at the table in a small coffee shop. That's what you do in Paris. And a group of Israeli tourists passing by, who heard us conversing in Hebrew, stopped and asked for direction to get to the fast food falafel place. Falafel is very popular street food item, which became also popular in Europe. I was quite puzzled, and I asked them, why go for falafel and not try the different foods Paris can offer you? Then one of the tourists answered, because I long to feel at home in Paris. And I thought it over afterwards, and I thought, okay, that's actually what happens in cultural relations, and translation is always kind of cultural relations between at least two cultures. Because translation in general and children's literature in particular always involves the tension that can be described metaphorically as a tension between the wish to make the readers feel at home and the desire to make them citizens of the world. So you have a tension between at home and being citizens of the world. Translation is constantly characterized by the conflicting need to invite the stranger home and the opposite effort to make what is foreign known and recognized. As we all know, translation involves the need to accommodate to both the cultural repertoire of the source text and the cultural repertoire of the target system. And I follow here Gideon Turi, a theory on target and source system. Now, it is important for me to emphasize that it is not merely a need for linguistic accommodation, but rather the need for cultural accommodation. And one of the means to answer this need for cultural accommodation is by domestication. Domestication is the process of transforming foreign elements of the source system into familiar elements of the target system. The process of domestication involves the conversion of various elements of the source text, such as names, colloquial expressions, customs, religious holidays, and calendars, into the word of the target system. And most of my talk today will be devoted to this process. And the examples I'll bring will, I hope, show us how this process of domestication involves the conversion of these various elements. I would like to note, however, that translation domestication actually is not the same as cultural translation, as is perhaps implied by some scholars, for instance, EPIM. Okay, we'll stay with this slide, but it's too early for us. And I would like to devote few words on the notion of cultural translation. Now, the point of departure of translation, cultural translation, is the understanding that translational processes always involve an adaptation and adjustment of the text of culture and cultural models. It is important to emphasize that it is never just text, it is always cultural models as well, of the source system to the text and cultural models of the target system, while subordinating them to the systemic constraints of one or both systems. And this is, here I follow the late Gideon Turi work and Evan Zohar work. Now, in light of such an understanding of the act of translation, we may well ask whether it is at all possible to produce a translation that is not cultural. And in fact, I believe that every translation is cultural in the sense that it is always the result of an ongoing dialogue between at least two cultures and the continuous tensions between them, as Baba shows, thus making the notion of cultural translation, in fact, somehow redundant. If every translation is cultural, what do we need the notion of cultural translation for? For this reason, I would like to propose a much narrower understanding of the notion of cultural translation and reserve it only for those cases in which translations play an active role as agents of social and cultural change and serve as a vehicle for presenting and promoting such changes, as was, for instance, the case of translations during the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement. But this is a topic that merits a separate discussion, and it will not be the topic of my talk today. Maybe if Pilar will organize another meeting, I will be able to present my discussion of cultural translation. At any rate, Leuven University just published a volume where I've seen that some of the participants of this series take part, and there I have an article on the notion of cultural translation. My talk today will focus on the function of domestication in the accommodation of translation of books for children. And with the help of some examples drawn from translated Hebrew children's literature, I will focus on the domestication of translation in early Hebrew children's literature, namely in the first decades of the last century, of the 20th century. I will broach the following issues: changing characters' names, accommodation to Jewish customs and religious holidays, and accommodation to the Jewish calendar. So in the course of my talk, you will hear quite a lot about the Jewish calendar and the Jewish holidays because they are put in the front in those translations. Now we'll move to the change of first name. The norm of itself of changing character's name has long dominated translations into Hebrew of both adult and children's literature. For instance, in the 19th century, the first translations of Shakespeare renamed Othello to Itiel Akushi, Itiel the Black, and Romeo and Juliet to Ram and Yael, trying to stay close to the sound of the original names. However, long after this norm had ceased to dominate translations of adult literature, it still dominated translations of children's literature. An early translation of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, done in 1924, made Alice Alisa, Mabel Sarah, and Mary Ann, which is a generic name for a maid, into Hannah Dvora. The first translation of Tom Sawyer, published in 1911, turned Tom into Tam, which in Hebrew means innocent, and of course, innocent is far removed from describing Tom Sawyer accurately. Becky, they changed into Becky, and Mary into Mary. Again, in an attempt to adhere to the original sound of the first names and not to the meaning of the name. Next one, please. Here I may prepare the table of the change that took place in names. So Alice and Mary Ann and Mabel I've mentioned already. Liz and Lena were changed into Ruth and Rina. You know Liz and Lena? It's the kind of the feminist version on Max and Moritz by Hulda von Levetstov, and it's very funny. Mitza Ben-Ari, a scholar of translation, shown how Butterfly Gottfried in the Konferenz der Türe becomes Avshalom, and the twin girls in Erich Kästner, Das Doppelte Lottchen, becomes Ora and Lee, drawn from the two halves of a common Hebrew name, Lior. Now, more interesting cases are when the Bible used to give the protagonist biblical name. Thus, for instance, in the first Hebrew translation of Max and Morris, the translator named the two troublemakers, Shimon and Levi, thus enhancing the protagonist's characterization as evil. Next one, please. Next slide, please. Pilar?
Yeah, it's there.
Can we move to the next slide?
Okay, the next one after that one, after the one here, yeah? Yeah?
Yeah, and then
the next one. Okay.
Okay, so here, in order to ensure that the reader would not miss the reference to the Bible, he added as an epigraph one verse of Jacob's blessing to his son. Shimon and Levi are brothers. Instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. And in Hebrew, Shimon ולוי, אחים כלי חמאס מכורותיהם. Now, during the 20s, the 30s, and even later, children were well versed in the Bible, and these biblical names indeed brought into the text the characterization of the biblical protagonist, or the biblical names from which they were taken. In a later translation published in 1939, the translator named Onkel Fritz, he named it Onkel Mordechai, alluding perhaps to the culturally well-known uncle Mordechai in the Book of Esther. The reason for giving the protagonists Hebrew names also had to do with the attempt to evoke the cultural background behind those names, for instance, by evoking biblical allusions. Or in the words of Gideon Turi, the translator was looking for names which will be Hebrew, not in form only, but will also be suggestive for the Hebrew reader. That is, evoke in him certain associations on the basis of his cultural background, meaning first and foremost as a minimal common denominator, a fairly good knowledge of the Bible. So actually it sort of evokes the knowledge of the Bible among his reader. The change of certain names also stems from the popularity of a particular name in the repertoire of the current child culture. For example, in the 20s, the name Uri was very popular, perhaps because two best-known poetess of Hebrew poetry for children. No, we're not yet. We're not there. Rachel and Leah Goldberg called their protagonist Uri. So in the translation of A.A. Milne and classics, when we are very young, Christopher Rubin became Uri, which was ultimate name for a boy. And even today, it's a very popular name. We just had our Minister of Transport had newborn child, and she called him Uri. So it's still very popular name. Okay, accommodate. Now we move to the next theme, and this is accommodation to Jewish customs and religious holidays. Now, this things become a little bit more complicated because domestication involved adapting the original text to Jewish custom, such as Jewish dietary laws, kashrut. Now, kashrut is a very complicated matter, and non-religious people like myself find it hard even to know all the rules. But I would say that most Israelis keep the basic rules, like don't eat pork or don't mix milk with meat, but will be less observant when it comes to other laws, like the ones we are going to see. Now, the first trick of Max and Moritz involves hanging widow Bolte hens, and the poor hens pass away. The widow Bolte removes the dead chickens and proceeds without hesitation to roast them for dinner. Eventually, it is Max and Moritz who will enjoy the feast. Now, this episode posed a serious problem for Jewish translations. According to the Jewish dietary laws, Jews are not allowed to eat carcasses, dead elements that were dead before, and the animals must be taken to the butcher, the shochet in Hebrew. But here, the hens were dead before they were taken to the butcher. And in those years, translated into Hebrew, was intolerant to non-kosher hints or references, and respected the laws of the kashrut, and did not tolerate mentioning any non-kosher food. Hence, usually Hebrew translations simply tended to omit this anecdote. However, the translator into Yiddish found a creative solution and added an entire paragraph to the translation. Now, the truth of the matter is that Yiddish literature lies behind the scope of my study, but I will mention this solution briefly because it is so amusing. The translator could not have a good Jewish widow prepare a meal from such an abomination, especially in light of the fact that this meal would later be eaten by Jewish children, because you don't follow the Jewish law of kashrut. Now, as Chonesh Meruk, the great Yiddish scholar, has shown, the translation provided a most creative solution to this problem. Coming upon the hanged chickens, the widow quickly grabs the knife. Now we can move to the next slide. Please, Pilar. She removes, and no, yeah, it's okay now. You can move to the next one. Pilar, please, yeah. She cuts the string, saves their life. You see, so they are not dead yet. The birds gasp and shudder, try to steer, but barely flutter. But enough steers shed, I must decide what else to do before they are died. They've died. The only solution left, I feel, is to make them into a Shabbat meal, Saturday meal. Off to the Sholchet, Batshul stall, she cries, she grabs them, and off she flies. Soon hens and roosters are no more. She quickly returns through her kitchen door to pluck salt. Again, you have to salt the meat before you cook it and soak them as she ought, and drain them whole as she was taught. So you see, this widow, she doesn't break any of the dietary rules, but she keeps to all the rules. She saves their life, she plucks, she salts, she soaks them as she ought, and she does drain them well as she was taught. Now, one of the most influential critics of the period complained in a footnote to a lengthy review of this translation of Max and Moritz that the translation had allowed the baker to prepare cakes from wheat flour on the eve of Passover. It's not even Passover, a holiday during which Jews are not allowed to eat any wheat at all. So you see that you had to observe many laws, not only in daily life and in your practices, but also in literature for children. Okay, we can move to the next one. Pork products and pigs turn out to be the most problematic. Any reference to food products relating to pork was doomed to be left out, even the very mention of the word pig itself. This is what happens, for instance, in the following scene. Alice in Wonderland is in the middle of a conversation with the Duchess regarding the Cheshire Cat. You certainly remember this scene. All of a sudden, the Duchess becomes upset and shouts, "Pig!" Alice is very relieved to find out that the Duchess is not referring to her, but rather to a baby, which will eventually be transformed into a pig. We all remember how she holds him, and in her hands he becomes a pig. The conversation, but we have to see what the translators do when they translate it into Hebrew. Now, the conversation returns to the previous theme. And this whole passage is built around Carol's play with nonsense and idioms, such as the well-known enigmatic idiom to grin like a Cheshire cat. Now, to respond to Alice's question on the subject, the Duchess explains. "Please, would you tell me," said Alice a little timidly, for she was not quite sure whether it was good manners for her to speak first, "why your cat grins like that?" "It is a Cheshire cat," said the Dutch, "and that's why." "Pig," she said the last word with such sudden violence that Alice quite jumped. Okay, now the translator had to find a solution to this mention of the word pig, as well as to compensate for the enigmatic idiom about the Cheshire cat. And we know that one of the most difficult issues to solve in translations are idiomatic expression, especially when they are enigmatic. Now, he omitted the pig altogether from the translation without offering any compensation for this omission. As to the play with nonsense, he replaced the enigmatic English idiom with a no less enigmatic expression in Hebrew. In the Hebrew translation, the Duchess explains that the cat grins because it has just thought of Hanukkah pancake. This is a typical dish of the Jewish winter festival of the Lights holiday, which will begin next week. Can we move to the next one, please? "Can you tell me, if you please," said Alice in a very soft voice, because she didn't know whether it was polite or physical, why does the cat grin?" "Because he's just called the pancakes he had for Hanukkah, answered the princess. So what the translator does here is to replace the idiomatic expression of smile, green like Cheshire green, with another, perhaps less enigmatic phrase of the pancake of Hanukkah. Now, the title of the 10th chapter of Alice, The Lobster Cow Drill, posed a problem because lobsters are not kosher either. The translator did not offer any substitute for the title and simply titled the chapter by its number. So it's not called the Lobster Quadrille, but it's called Chapter 10. He also omitted a sentence recounting how Alice had once stated a lobster. On the other hand, he greatly expanded a paragraph discussing all kinds of now kosher fish. Now, in the original, in Carol's version, the text goes on, do you know why is it called the whitening? I never thought about it, said Alice. Why? It does the boots and shoes, the griffin replied very solemnly, which is, of course, nonsense. Now, in the Hebrew translation, the translator brought a different discussion of the fish. Do you know why it is called a vruma? Such a thought never crossed my mind, Alice answered. Why? Because the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are allowed to eat it. And Shibuta, isn't it allowed as well? Allowed indeed. That's why it is called Shibuta, as that is what we eat on Shabbat. So again, he plays here with the similarity of the sounds of Avruma like Avraham, Shibuta like Shabbat. Thus, the translator proposes here a discussion entirely based on the complete Judaization of nonsensical wordplay. Now we move to another theme that posed a problem, and this is any reference to Christian components where translators tended to replace them with Jewish components or omit them altogether. For example, in 1924 translation of Alice, Christian Eve becomes Rosh Hashanah, the new Jewish year. Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Little Match Girl, takes place on December 31st. The translator replaced the Christian New Year's Eve with Hanukkah. As I already mentioned, this is a Jewish holiday which takes place in the winter around the same time of the year that Christmas takes place. Consequently, and in fact, in line with its own inner logic, the Christmas tree becomes a Chanukiah, an high branch of menorah that symbolizes the Jewish holiday. We again find this kind of Judaization of Christian elements in translation of Erich Kästner, Das Doppelte Lotchen, where the protagonist faces are described as lightening like a Chanukiah. In the translation of When We Were Very Young, the boy whose name changed from Christopher Rubin to Uri, as already mentioned, plays Shema Israel, a centerpiece of the morning and evening Jewish prayer service. Nevertheless, and we'll see that sometimes the translations are not systematic. Here, the choreography of the Christian prayer remains because the Jewish boy still kneels next to his bed, unlike Jewish practice. God is called Adonai, and the evening prayer is called Tfilat Arvit, a Jewish prayer service held in the evening or night. So we have here a mixture of body language that refers to Christian habits or customs with the Jewish word in calling God by the Hebrew name of Adonai or calling the prayers by the Hebrew name of Tfilat Arvit. Now, in the fourth, this is a very amusing example. In the first chapter of Max and Morris, the boys play a cruel trick on their teacher. While he is away at church practicing the organ, they fill his tobacco pipe with gunpowder. It explodes when the teacher back from church sits down to smoke. Most translators prefer to omit this chapter entirely or in part because it's disrespect to the teacher. Nevertheless, even the translators who retained this chapter still avoided mentioning the church organ because it's such a symbol of the church. One translator did replace the organ, whose religious connotations were apparently too heavy to bear, with a piano. For some reason, perhaps technical difficulties, the original illustration with the organ remained. Thus, according to the illustration, the teacher plays an organ, but according to the written text, he plays the piano. So you can see here that he plays the piano, but the text, in the text, but in the illustrations, he plays the organ. And these norms dominated Hebrew translations to such an extent that even in 1970, the translator felt the need to omit the organ from his translation. Now, most translations into Hebrew of Max and Morris retain the wonderful original translations, as did most of the translations into Yiddish. However, as we'll see now, one of the translations adjusted the illustration to a Jewish setting, with the result that several details, as well as the ambience, were made Jewish. Let us look at the 1939 translation, which included domesticated illustrated, taken from Joseph Tunkel's Yiddish adaptation of Max and Moritz, and was described again in detail by Chonesh Merrick. Now, let's move to the next chapter, and we'll see how the illustrations were changed to adapt to the Jewish surrounding. So this is the original Max and Moritz, and here is the Judaized Jewish tailor. Note the change marked by red in the head cover and the added beard. These were not part of the original illustration. Onkel Fritz, this is how he is illustrated by Willem Bosch, and this is how he appears in Joseph Tunkel, and note the change in the head cover and the added beard. Next one, Bao Meke. This is how William Bush illustrated him. And next one, Farmer Yehuda. Of course, the name has changed as well. Note the change in the head cover and the added beard. And the last one is the baker, is again illustrated by Bosch. And here, the Jewish baker, where they changed the beard, and I mean, they added the beard and the head cover. Now, thus the translator, or actually the illustrator, decided to domesticate the illustrations in line with the new version of the story, which strives to make the foreign known and familiar. The Jewish surroundings was accomplished not only by systematic omissions of non-Jewish components, but also, as we've seen, through additions of distinctly Jewish elements. Furthermore, in some cases, episodes from Jewish history were added to the translated text, as well as references to Jewish holidays and to the Jewish calendar, which, as perhaps you know, is different from the Gregorian calendar in that it is based on lunisolar calendar, and today it's actually used only for determining the Jewish holidays. In daily practice, we use the Gregorian holiday, but you can always find on the calendar the Jewish month and the Jewish date according to the Jewish calendar. Now, the following example can perhaps illustrate the matter. The conversation that takes place between Alice, March Hare, and the Dormouse is one of the most cited passages of Alice. Let's have a look at it. I think we need the previous one. No? So, okay, excuse me. So they converse, and then March has say, why? You might just as well say that I see what I eat is the same thing as I eat what I see. You might just as well say, added the March Hare, that I like what I get is the same thing as I get what I like. You might as well say, added the Dormouse, which seem to be talking in his sleep, that I breathe when I sleep is the same thing as I sleep when I breathe, and so on and so forth. Now, the translator could not find an equivalent either to March Hare nor to the idiomatic phrase made as a March Hare, which characterizes the lively behavior of European hares during the spring breeding season. At least that's what Garner, who edited the scientific or annotated edition of Alice, maintains. Now, what the translation did was to replace the reference to the month of March with two Jewish holidays, Purim and Pesach, that usually takes place around March. Maybe we can move to the next slide. He also named the hare Ben Nissan. Nissan is the Hebrew name for the spring months in the Jewish calendar. So the Hebrew translation reads, do you mean that you'll find the answer? Asked the hare Ben Nissan. Is it the same thing they all asked as one? To say that we are all nuts from Purim until Pesach, as to say we are all nuts from Pesach until Purim. Now in Hebrew it is even more, it is stronger because Purim is always before Pesach. And of course it is not the same. So it is even more, it is stronger than the original in Eli's text. The translator also had replaced well-known episodes in English history with episodes taken from Jewish history. The following example is taken from another oft passage in Yanis. Whenever I go to conferences or meetings on history, the chairperson almost always use this episode where the mouse tries to dry the audience. Now, the translator, Alice and her friends come out of the pool of tears, wet and shivering. You remember this thing. The mouse takes upon himself the duty of a responsible adult and assures them that he will dry them up. I'll soon make you dry enough. And indeed he does. He really dries them by telling them some boring anecdotes of English history, which Carol took from Havilad Chappell's short course of history. Ham, said the mouse with an important air, are you all ready? This is the driest thing I know. Silence all around, if you please. William the Conqueror, whose cause was favored by the Pope, was soon submitted to by the English, who wanted leaders and had been of late much accustomed and use of relation and conquest, etc., etc. Now, the translator didn't want to give the children, the his Hebrew readers, story of William the Conqueror. So he replaced the mouse lecture on William the Conqueror with a detailed and tiresome account of the Herodian dynasty taken from Jewish historiography. A short excerpt will suffice to illustrate the matter. As you know, Herod relied on the Romans and persecuted Antigonus' allies and the Hasmoneans. Old Hyrcanus and his daughter Alexandra and her two children, Miriam and Aristobulus, and so on and so forth, and he manages probably to drive his readers as well. In a later episode, Alice complains that she seems to have forgotten everything she knows and that her memory had faded. The caterpillar tries to comfort her and suggests she tries to recite Your Old Father William, a reference to a well-known poem by Robert Southey, which begins as follows. You are old, Father William, the young man cried. The few looks which are left you are grey. You are old, hell, Father William, a healthy old man. Now tell me the reason, I pray. Now this is the original poem which was written 100 years earlier, but was included in anthologies for children. Alice, as we all know, of course, mocks the old tradition of children's poems and text for children, and he replaced it by a parody. You are old, Father William, the young man said, and your hair has become very white, and yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think in your age is it right? Now again, the translator could not provide a literal translation of the poem, which without a footnote would not mean anything to the reader, to the Jewish reader, but in fact I believe that it would not mean anything to a English-speaking reader today. Now, he searched instead for equivalent in Hebrew, but he couldn't find in Hebrew children's literature at this stage of this development a poem that every child might know by heart. We have to remember that Hebrew children's literature just began to develop. So he retreated, so to speak, to the canonical reservoir of Jewish religious texts and offered a poem taken from the Haggadah. Can we move to the next slide? This is the Haggadah. It's a text that is read aloud by all participants during every Passover Seder. And Seder is a Jewish ritual feast performed by a community or by multiple generations of a family. Here, this is taken from the Seder that Obama made to the Jewish community of Washington. Now, this is a very well-known festival and ritual, and it involves the retelling of the story of the liberation of the Israelites from slavery in ancient Egypt. Embedding well-known, can we move to the next one? Embedding well-known phrases of the Jewish canon, which allude to the Jewish canon, obviously enhance the domestication of the translated text. The translator could, of course, assume that this text would be recognized by any of his readers, particularly the selected portion, which is especially popular with children. Who knows the 7? I know the 7. 7 are the days of the week. And then it goes, 6 are the orders of the Mishnah, 5 are the books of the Torah, 4 are the matriarchs, 3 are the patriarchs, 2 are the tablets of the covenant, and 1 is our God. in heavens and on earth. I would like to, Pilar, are we okay with this YouTube?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to share it.
I would like you to listen.
Yeah. So I'm going just to share it with everybody. Are you okay? Is it sounding?
So every child, we can assume that every child knows. You hear the children, they respond. It's also part of the ritual. Okay, I think this will do. I hope that I've convinced you that he could have used this poem as a compensation for the poems by Sotheby and the parodies on them. Anyway, as you remember, Alice fails to recite the text properly. The caterpillar interrupts her and mocks her with his own nonsensical substitutions. Now, to conclude, I would like to make a note on the historical context in which these translations were made. In the first decades of the last century, the body of Hebrew children's literature in Eretz Israel was young and fragile, and it addressed children for whom Hebrew, in most cases, was not the mother tongue. Moreover, modern Hebrew as a spoken language and a written language was undergoing a dramatic process of revival. Translations were an integral part of that revival were also used to impart the language both to children born in Eretz Israel and to those who were newly arrived. Hence, translated literature had a major function not only in expanding the body of Hebrew children's literature, but also in teaching the very language itself. An indication to this function can be found at the end of the translation to Oilish, where a page dedicated to difficult words explains several words in simple language and or translates them into other languages. Can we move to the next? Okay, here you have explanation of difficult words, and the explanation is given in 4 languages: English, French, Russian, and German. But what I find most interesting, not into Yiddish, which was spoken by the majority of the newcomers to Eretz Israel, but because of its status as inferior language, the translator did not bother to translate the difficult words into Yiddish, though it would have been much more helpful to his readers. Anyway, the subject of active languages in the background of the intended reader of translated literature, as well as the role of translated literature in imparting the Hebrew language, call for a separate discussion. So, Pilar, we have here 2 themes already. This is too soon. That we'll have to wait for a separate discussion. We have seen that the domestication of translated literature for children was part of an effort to make the foreign familiar and known. It involved exchanging English or German first names for Hebrew names, replacing Christian holidays and customs with Jewish holidays and customs, as well as making allusions and references to the Jewish canon. Needless to say that such decision made by translators were not merely linguistic, but rather cultural, resulting in translations that accommodate the source text to the cultural repertoire of the receiving system. And I would like to end with a personal anecdote. One of my own translation that is dearest to my heart is that of the wonderful American children's classic, Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. As the film based on the book was screened in Israel prior to the publication of the translation, the publisher insisted that to use the title of the film for the book, and thus the book was given the awkward title, The Magic Farm. But this, I must admit, was my least challenging problem. Much more difficult was the Jewish aversion towards pigs. Now, I imagine that you remember Charlotte's Web, and who is the main protagonist? Of course, Wilbur the pig. The two main protagonists of Charlotte's Web are the spider Charlotte and Wilbur, who, unfortunately for him and for me as a translator, was born as a pig. The story relates the miraculous way in which Charlotte manages to save Wilbur from a terrible fate. But how can we present Wilbur the pig as a protagonist worthy of a young reader's sympathy? The solution I found was an ad hoc solution, and even today I feel uncomfortable about it. Wilbur the pig was not called Pig, but Piggy. I'm not sure students of zoology would approve of this solution, but everybody except for the translators themselves felt happy about it. Thank you very much. Toda raba.
Thank you.